So we'll get going here. This is the Calibration and Field Checks webinar. Now that all of the intro stuff is out of the way, we can get going. So some things that we're going to look at today, we're going to talk about field check versus calibration. They're not one and the same. We'll look at how to check your gauge, a lot of do-it-yourself stuff that you can do in the field or in the office just to make sure that your equipment is behaving the way it should. We'll talk about checking tubing. Retrotec has released several different models of duct tester and blower door fans over the years, and so depending on which models you guys have, we'll take a look at each one just to show you how to look at several things to make sure it's behaving properly. When does your equipment need to be calibrated? We'll look at that, and as well as a little sneak peek of what goes on in the factory when you're sending your equipment back into us. So one thing about the Retrotec lab, we are ISO 17025 accredited. That's a certification that we like to show off. It's not easy to obtain. It's not easy to keep up, and so we're pretty proud of it. One question that we get from a lot of equipment users is, well, can I just send my gauge to somebody else to calibrate it that's more local? Well, you know, technically you can, but we don't recommend it because we don't know what type of parts that they use, if they're Retrotec parts or what, or if they did anything at all. But one thing that we say, if you are going to go that route to get your equipment calibrated, make sure they're an accredited lab, because if not, you're really not doing yourself any favors. But no matter if you use TEC or our equipment, your best bet is always to send it back to the manufacturer to get it calibrated. But if not, always look for a certification. And so going back to that, no matter which brand you use, always use the manufacturer's guidelines. So, you know, don't use TEC standard or protocols for field checking our equipment. It doesn't really work that way. Some things might be a little similar, but as far as, you know, the type of readings you're looking for, don't mix and match. The only mixing and matching that really occurs is the ability for you to use our DM32 gauge with their fans. Otherwise, nothing is really compatible across the board. So always keep that in mind. So a couple of definitions. Calibration, that's what we do at the factory when you send it back into us. The way it is. A field check is something that you can do on your own to make sure that your equipment is calibrated. So if you do a field check, that doesn't mean you calibrated it. That's just routine maintenance. That's just checking to make sure that it is within calibration, and if it's off, then you send it back off to us to get calibrated. So just a couple of terms there to get us started. And so I wanted to put this slide in to show you, this is just shows some of the margins of error of gauges and fans, and this is for ResNet standards of how they perform. And so if you look in the middle, we'll start on the left side. This is a gauge, which can be plus or minus 1%. And so if we're doing a blower door test and we're going to pressurize at 50, that means, you know, at 1%, it could be, you know, 50.5 or 49.5, you know, within 0.5 Pascal, that's, you know, your 1% of 50 there. And then if you take that over to the right-hand side and look at the fan, that can be within 5%. And that includes the margin of error from the gauge. And so there's a lot more room there. So if we're getting a flow of 936.4 CFM, that can fluctuate 46.8 CFM in either direction. And that's within calibration. That's what we're allowed. That's the margin of error that we're allowed to be within. If you're not checking your field, if you're not checking your equipment before you take it out in the field, then if it's worse than this, then, you know, that's a number that can break you. So just kind of showing the importance of, you know, field checking, making sure you're within calibration, making sure that your readings are correct. And so we wanted to show this graph too. This is a graph showing the equipment that we've sold and how much of that has been calibrated. So as you can see, it's a very small percentage. 94% is not being calibrated. And so there's, hopefully, I'm hoping some of these people are actually checking to make sure that it is reading the way it should, but if not, you know, there could be some equipment out there that's, you know, giving some funky readings. And you can see in the blue, that's, you know, 1% of the fans has been calibrated, and then the red, that's 5% of gauges. So not a whole lot coming back. So it's, if you're not sending stuff back into calibration after the time's up, then at least make sure you're doing your field checks to make sure that it is reading properly. So when we talk about field checks today, like I said before, we're going to talk about gauges. We're going to talk about your fans, both duct tester and blower door. And we're also going to talk about tubing. As simple as it may sound, tubing plays a large role in this. And so we'll start with gauges. Well, whether if it's a gauge or a fan, if you have Retrotec equipment, I'm sure you've noticed that our equipment comes with a quick guide. It's just a reference sheet that you can take out in the field to go through different settings, but there's also a field check quick guide that comes with it as well. And if you've misplaced this, you no longer have it, don't worry, you can download it off our website. If this is something you want to keep in your field bag, sometimes it can come in handy. If you're getting some weird readings out in the field and you're not sure why, a lot of times it's good to check your equipment and have a good checklist of how to do that. So how often should you update your equipment? Well, your fans are every 5 years. So that's both duct tester and blower door. And if you have a DM32 gauge, that is also every 5 years. But if you have a DM2, our older gauge before the DM32, that's still every 2 years. And if you've been paying attention, if you guys are HERS raters, coming up July 1st, and what they are saying about equipment calibration is that it just falls back on the manufacturer. And so if you're using Retrotec equipment, and if you're trying to confirm to, or comply to ResNet 380, then those are the, that's the amount of time that you'll have to send your equipment in for calibration. We'll also talk about updating the firmware for the DM32 gauge as well as we get to that. So to field check your gauge, there's a nice check sheet for that to show you how to check different sides. Basically on your manometer, you have two manometers built in one. You have channel A and channel B. And essentially what you're doing is checking one side against the other in all possible combinations. And so everything's color coded, and so it just shows you if you have tubing, what color to check against the other color, just to make sure that you're not, you should be reading some kind of pressure, because as you connect it port to port, it builds a pressure inside the tubing. And so you should be reading something. If you're reading 0, there's a leak somewhere, either in the gauge or in the tubing itself. And so to do your field check, it'll look something like this. If you're just checking your gauge one side against another, if you're using one of our umbilicals, just make sure you're using the same piece of tubing. So if you pick yellow, make sure you have both ends. Otherwise, if you use a yellow and a red, you're not going to read anything. So make sure you're using the same piece of tubing. And in your settings, you want to make sure you're reading pressure versus pressure for both channels. You don't want it set to any type of flow. As far as the device is what you're set to, it doesn't really matter. So yeah, you're just reading the pressure of one side versus the other. And so these are the different combinations. So you'll check blue against green with one piece of tubing. Use that same piece of tubing to move it over. You'll check red against yellow. And you'll check red against green. And as you notice on the screen, you have the same pressure reading on channel A and channel B. And it should be within 1 Pascal. And again, on the last, you'll check blue against yellow. And so if something's way off, I would try another piece of tubing. If it's still way off, then chances are you have something going on with your gauge that you want to send in and get it looked at. You can also check one gauge against another. So if you have several gauges and you send one in and get calibrated, you get it back, it's freshly calibrated, you can check it against your other gauges to see how those are doing. And if you're a HERS rater and you're working under a provider, I know a lot of times providers will bring their own gauge out and check it against the rater's gauge. So that's another time where this will come in handy. And so I mentioned the firmware update earlier, so we'll talk about what that is. So you have firmware in your DM32. That's what keeps it going. You can see what type you have on the splash screen right when it starts up, and then it also appears in the bottom left after startup. Or you can go into your settings and cycle through to the third page, and it'll tell you what kind of or what build of firmware you have there. And depending on what model fan you have too, there's also firmware in the fans as well. That's not something that you can update, but if you send it in for calibration, Retrotec will make sure that that's up to date as well. And so in order to use this on your laptop, you'll have to download the DM32 configurator from our website. You'll just go to retrotec.com and you'll find that under support. And it's free. Just go ahead and download it. And then using the USB cable that comes with your gauge, you'll just plug it right up. The configurator will find your gauge, and then it'll search for a download. Oh, let me go back. It'll search for a download, and you'll be able to update it from there. And so on our new website, that's what it looks like. And so from our landing page, you'll go to software, and then you'll see an option for pressure gauge, and it'll take you to this screen. And then the configurator is what you want to download. And so if you have one of these gauges already and you haven't yet done so, yeah, go ahead and give this a download and check it out, see if there's an update for you. And so this is what it looks like. It'll pull the download for you. Of course, it'll tell you not to unplug it. And then anything that you can do on your gauge, you can also adjust on your laptop while your gauge is connected. So any of your settings, whether if it's your network settings or Wi-Fi settings, you can also recalibrate the touchscreen from here, fix sensor configuration, repair images, some do-it-yourself maintenance you can do on your gauge if things aren't acting quite right. So this is just a good handy tool to have. So that pretty much sums it up for gauges. Next, I'll talk about tubing. Whether you're using our umbilical or any other kind of tubing, this is stuff that you always want to check. And so similar to checking your gauge from one side to another, you can also check your tubing this way to see if it's blocked or if there's a leak in it somewhere. Just check it on one side against the other, and you should be reading the same pressure on both sides. So if you have a blockage or a leak, it'll show up there. So it's always good to check your umbilical too. So this is how you'll set that up. Very similar to checking your gauge. And so when it comes to tubing in the field, one thing that's not your friend is water. One little drop can throw off everything. And not just water, other construction debris as well. I can remember one time I was doing a duct test and the supplies were in the ceiling and I didn't realize it, but I got there just after an installer left and he was doing some last minute air sealing on the inside of the boots on the seams. And so as I got everything set up, I ran my test, everything was set up right. I wasn't getting a reading, couldn't figure out why, checked out everything in my test setup, took everything down, put everything back up. And of course, the last thing I checked was my reference hose that I plugged in to the duct system to check the duct system pressure through the supply. And as I pulled it down, there was a big glob of wet mastic on it. And so of course I was going to throw my reading off. So it doesn't take much. And so water can do the same thing. So can dust, anything that gets in there. As you know, the diameter of the tubing opening is very, very small. So on a rainy day, if you're in a rush, sometimes you can drag it through a puddle. That's all it would take. So it's always good to check this out. And if you have water in there, if you think you have water in there, the best way to do it is just sling it around. You can also blow on it, but if you do that, make sure it's not hooked up to a gauge, make sure it's not hooked up to a fan. But giving it a good sling will usually get it out. And then you can just dry out the ends, hook it back up, check it on your gauge, make sure everything is reading the way it should. And that's pretty much it for tubing. But it's just one little thing that can throw everything else off. That's good to keep in the back of your mind. So now we'll go through fans. We'll talk about duct testers and blower doors through different models. There's some visual inspections you can do. So some things you want to check for is motor alignment and then fan blade clearance from the shell. You can also check flow on both fans. You can also check for internal leaks and blockages. And so we'll go through on how to do that for each model. And so as you guys know, we've had several different blower door models come out over the years. So different designs will call for different ways to inspect for motor alignment and fan blade clearance. Some of the older models you can see used to be the old foam filled shell. Then we moved to a lighter weight shell that's a more sturdy plastic. And so if you're going to check for motor alignment, the way to do it is you want to lie the fan down on the floor with the nacelle facing up. The nacelle is that piece in the middle, the yellow in this picture here. This is a Model 5000 fan. It's that yellow piece that has the pressure ports around it. And so also this stuff you can find in the blower door manual. If you have an older fan and you don't have that manual anymore, don't sweat it. You can reach out to us or you can just download it off of our website. We have all of that still on there. But going back to this, looking at motor alignment, you want to take a straight, after you lie that fan on the ground, you want to take a straight edge and lay it across the diameter of the fan. And so if you have this model fan, there really shouldn't be a gap between that straight edge and the label in the center of the nacelle. If there is, it shouldn't be any more than 1/8 of an inch. And then if you have an older Model 3000 fan, which, pre-2016, same process, just different measurement. Since it's a different fan design, the motor is going to line up a little bit differently with respect to the shell. And so there should be about 1/8 of an inch gap on this one, but no more than 1/4 of an inch. And then our Model 1000 and 2000 fans, again, you'll use the same process, but different measurement. And what you're looking for on this model is 3/16 of an inch and no more than 5/16 of an inch. So it should fall somewhere within that window. And if you're not sure what model fan you have, you should be able to take a look on the fan and see. If for some reason you can't tell, you should be able to just take a look at it and just match it up with the manuals that you can find on our website. And if you're not sure, you can also always just reach out to us just to make sure. And then we have this under blower door fan because technically you can use this as a blower door. Some people do for passive house. This is a Model 300 duct tester fan. And this uses a totally different type of fan blade. It has a centrifugal blower impeller type blade. So it's not your axial fan that you're going to see on the blower door or on the TEC duct blaster. And so on this, as long as it turns and doesn't rub, it's not going to affect flow measurement. So basically, as long as you don't hear any noises that you weren't hearing before, it should be okay. And then for fan blade clearance for the 1000, 5000, and 6000 fans, you want 1/8 of an inch between each blade and the shell. And then 2000 and 3000 model fans, you want somewhere between 3/16 and 1/4 of an inch clearance between the tip of the blade and the shell. Obviously, if it's rubbing the shell, there's a problem, but there shouldn't be any larger gap than 1/4 of an inch for those models. And so now we'll go in and talk about how to check for blockages and leaks. On the blower door, the way that it reads pressure, on the nacelle, you have 4 pressure taps. And this is a 5000 or a 1000, 5000, the 6000 model fan as well, has this type of setup. And so this is where your pressure is being read. And there's an airtight tunnel that connects these. And then from that tunnel, it's connected to the pressure taps where you connect your gauge. And so there's a few connections in there, and you just want to make sure that everything is sealed up tight, not leaking, or make sure that it's not blocked by anything. And if you have the older model fans with the red nacelle, the pressure taps are going to look a little different. They're just small holes around the side, and so they'll look like that. You can also check flow if you want to run the fan wide open to see what it's going to pull. And this will vary depending on voltage as well. But you can see here we have it for each model fan, what the Pascal reading should be if you have the fan on the open range, running wide open. And so for each model, you can take a look at this just to make sure that it's pulling within 15%. And we say 15% because it varies depending on, you know, the power source that it's plugged up to. So we'll talk about checking flow on these sensors to see if there's a leak or if there's blockage. You'll notice silly putty is the best way to look at this. You know, we tried using tape, like whether it's painter's tape or masking tape. For this type of nacelle, you can notice that the plastic is kind of textured. It's not really smooth. And so the tape doesn't really give you a good seal, even though it feels like it may. So what we found is silly putty is the best way to stick this on there. And you don't have to worry about any getting left behind. The silly putty does a good job of pulling the entire piece off when you're ready to remove it. And so what happens here is that you'll hook your gauge up to it like so in the picture. You'll put your silly putty on, and then you'll check each port individually. And then it should go back down to 0. Because basically what you're doing is that you're clogging up each port, and you have your gauge connected to the fan, and so it's going to build up pressure in there. And just like here in the picture, it gives it a reading. And so if you were to pull off one of these silly putty pieces off of this nacelle, it should go down to 0 after a few seconds. And then so you'll just check each one individually like that. And on this model, there's 4, and so you'll look and find all 4 of them, plug them all up, and then check each one by one. And so it's important that you don't use anything else. Make sure it's just silly putty. Don't use Play-Doh, don't use clay, because it'll leave the port clogged up, or it'll leave residue, or dirt will stick to it later on. Silly putty is the way to go. It's a cheap and easy material to use. So believe it or not, there's a technical use for silly putty. And on the 5000 and 6000 model fans, the ones that have the yellow nacelle, you'll really kind of have to dig it in there. And it's okay. You feel like you're going to clog it up and damage it, but it's okay. You can stick it in there pretty good, because once you pull it out, it's going to pull it all out in one piece. Actually just did this a few days ago, and it works really well. And so again, on the 5000 and 6000 model fans, this is what it'll look like when you put the silly putty on that to check each of the 4 ports. Now the duct tester is a little bit different. You have the green and the yellow port that you hook your gauge up to, and so you'll check those pressure readings are coming from 2 different spots on the fan. And so first we'll look at the yellow port, and if you have a Model 300 fan, this is what it's going to look like. And so since the plastic is pretty smooth, it's not textured on this model, you can use tape. So painter's tape or masking tape will work just fine. And there's 8 ports that you'll want to close up. And so to check the flow on each one, or not the flow, but to check each pressure tap, you'll untape each one, wait for it to go down to 0, tape it back, and move to the next one. And you'll have to wait a few seconds because the ports are pretty small. So as you release, it'll take a few seconds for that pressure to go down to 0. And now we'll look at the green port. These pressure taps are along the edge. And so they're a little hard to find, but you'll see that there's 2 holes for each one. There's one kind of on the front, and then there's one on the side. The one on the side is what you want. And so that's where your reading is coming from. And so there's 4 of these. And so we're going back to the silly putty because we don't have a smooth surface to tape to. And so you'll silly putty up all 4 of those. And again, the same process. Make sure you're plugged into the green port. You'll see the pressure build once you plug up your gauge, and then you'll check each one by one. This one you'll have to take some good care to make sure you get a good seal, because you can see those ridges in there where the collar attaches to. So you want to make sure you get a good seal around each port. Now, if you have an older DU200 duct tester, there's a fewer amount of sensors. So going back to the yellow port, there's just 2 on the inside, on the sides. And so this one has a more textured plastic. So you can't use tape on this one. You got to go back to the silly putty. So you'll just clog up those 2 ports to the silly putty and then check each one individually. And then for the green port on the 200, there's 2 more on the outside, and it's top and bottom. So same, we're still using the silly putty here. Just find those 2 small holes, clog them up, and then check each one. And this slide just kind of goes over what I was talking about earlier. You'll untape one, wait for it to go to 0, put it back, check the next one, and you'll go around in a circle until you're finished to make sure that each one does 0 out after you untape it. This is a picture that one of our CEOs sent. You know, we're testing construction with these fans, and sometimes you get all kinds of stuff pulled through there. So this one got a lot of drywall dust pulled through. And so it's a good idea to keep your stuff cleaned out. So this one came back in for calibration, but if you're out in the field using one like this, I would definitely recommend cleaning this out the best you can. Air compressor, shop vac. Go ahead and get that stuff out, because you don't want that ending up getting into your port somehow. So sometimes you'll see some interesting stuff coming back in for calibration. And so we'll talk about how to check for flow next. On our blower door, if you have one of these and you got your quick guide, there's a way where you can make a do-it-yourself test plate to check, to make sure that your blower door is reading as the way it should. I'm sure you've noticed, you've seen our duct tester plates that you can do to check for flow. We don't really make one for the blower door, but it's easy to make your own. You can take a piece of rigid foam, or really any rigid board, piece of plywood, whatever, and cut a hole in it like you see here in the picture. And so this one's a 20 by 20 inch hole, so you'll have 400 square inches. And so if you run it first with just the fan, and you get your leakage number, and then you run it again with this plate in it, with it sealed up around it with just that hole, now you have a known hole size of leakage, and you subtract one from the other, and it should be 400 if you have it set to equivalent leakage area. And so here's another way. I mean, you can use a small room, or you can use a whole house. It doesn't really matter. But this is easy to make your own, and just to make sure that your blower door is reading as it should. If you have a known hole, then you can know if it's behaving the way it should. And then we have here on your gauge, you just want to make sure you click the equivalent leakage area in square inches. That way you can see that difference on the gauge. So it really doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter what size hole you use. You can use 12 by 12, 20 by 20, whatever. As long as it's a known hole and you know what the total area is of that hole, then you should be able to figure it out pretty easily. Now the duct tester, you can do the same thing. You can make your own, or we sell the field check plates that you can hook up to your clear flange and tape around the edges. And then, if you can see, this picture is pretty small, but there's a plate, or there's a sticker on the plate that'll tell you what your flow should be, depending if you pressurize or depressurize your flex with this plate attached to the end of it. And so I think if you pressurize it, it should be 104. And so this is what your setup would look like. you want to attach this to the end of your flex and then extend the flex all the way out. And then you just want to make sure that your gauge is reading whatever that number is on the field check plate. But like I said, you can also make your own. So back at the factory, this is what the calibration chamber looks like. This is what each fan, blower door fan goes through, whether if it's new coming out of the factory or if it's coming back in to get recalibrated. This is a look behind the scenes of what it looks like. Each fan gets a 9-point fit. And then in the gauge room, this is what each brand new DM32 goes through to get calibrated. And if you send your gauges back in, it just gets put back through this just to make sure that it's reading the way it should. And again, we like to show this off. This is our calibration certification for the lab. And then each time you get a piece of equipment certified or calibrated, you'll have a certificate saying that it was certified by us, and then we do have the appropriate certification to do so. It'll have the date on it, so if your provider wants to know, you can send them a copy of it. And then this is a picture I like to show too. This is in the same room where all the gauges are put together by hand, and when they come back to get recalibrated, it's just a little memorabilia wall to show how the equipment has evolved over time since the beginning. So back in the day, back in the early 80s, it used to come in a suitcase or a protective briefcase like that. There's also a model that had a small printer built into it to give you a reading there, to give you a hard copy. So it's just kind of fun to look at to see how everything's evolved over the years. And that's what we have for calibration and field checks. Again, you can find more of this on YouTube. We'll have this one posted up later. So if you have guys in the field that you want to look at, we'll have it put up pretty soon. And I'm going to go to Lee here to see if we have any questions that have come in the box. Lee, do we have anything?
Yeah, there's a few things here. So
okay.
Let me see. William was asking if you could just open a window to add that leakage area instead of using a cutout with the blower door. You could, although that's difficult to measure. A lot of times the window lips will cause a little bit of like turbulence, so the measured area doesn't exactly match up to the opening area, if that makes sense. It's best to put a piece of cardboard in there and use a cutout to get an accurate opening, although you could try just a window. And then
true, and if the window isn't latched, it'll leak a little bit around the edges as well.
Yeah.
Depending on the window itself. So sometimes you'll get a measurement, but it might actually be a little bit more than that.
Thank you. Yep. Good point. Let's see. There's a question about hanging tubes. What to do when you're hanging tubes vertical distances. On that one, okay. It's not really covered in the calibration check, but if they're outside, you just want to keep them out of the sun so you don't get the heat heating up the air in the tube and throwing off your readings. Again, not really something they're going to run across for a field check. Let me see. Yeah, I think that was pretty much it. Most of the questions were covered in the webinar. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Okay, great. And if you guys are still on, if you have any more questions on down the road, just shoot us an email. Reach out to us. We're happy to answer any questions you guys have coming up. So if nothing else, we'll wrap it up. Thanks everybody for participating. Appreciate your time. Again, if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out. We're happy to help.